There is a particular solitude, known only to those who dare to look beyond the surface of things, not the loneliness of being without company, nor the ache of isolation that haunts those who fear being unseen. It is a different loneliness, quiet, lucid, and strangely demanding, the loneliness that arises when you begin to read what most eyes refuse to acknowledge, when you sense the subtle movements beneath human behavior, when you hear the unspoken tone behind a voice and feel the tremor behind a smile, when you perceive the architecture of people's fears long before they do. It is the loneliness of one who reads the invisible. Most human beings move through life almost as if wearing a veil woven by expectations, beliefs, unquestioned assumptions, habits inherited from a world that rarely pauses to inquire, a veil so familiar that it becomes indistinguishable from their sense of self. They walk with certainty, even when the foundations of that certainty are fragile, borrowed, or hollow. They cling to patterns because patterns are comforting, and the known, however limited, feels safer than the untamed vastness of perception. But some, for reasons they can rarely articulate, begin to notice cracks in the veil. It might start with a subtle discomfort, a feeling that something in the normal rhythm of life is slightly out of tune, a conversation that sounds rehearsed, a smile that hides more than it reveals, a moment of silence that feels truer than 1,000 spoken explanations. And in those gaps, in the pauses, in the inconsistencies, in the trembling between thought and action, something awakens, a sensing, a perception, a deeper seeing, and once you begin to see, you can no longer unsee. This is where the loneliness begins, for the one who sees the invisible is often surrounded by those who live entirely in the visible. They respond to the obvious, to the loud, to the socially acceptable forms of success, fear, desire, and ambition. They believe that intention is what people say it is. They assume that thought is honest just because it is spoken. They imagine that identity is real simply because it is repeated. But when you perceive the undercurrent, the quiet, the subtle, the hidden, you begin to realize how little of human life is consciously lived. You begin to see that most conflicts are not between people, but between their conditioning. You begin to see that fear speaks louder than love in most decisions. You begin to see that desire is not freedom, but compulsion. You begin to see that what people call purpose is often an escape from stillness. You begin to see that the anger of a person has little to do with you and much to do with their own inner wounds. And when you see all this, you find yourself standing slightly apart, not by choice but by perception. This distance can feel like solitude, a solitude that is not born of rejection, but of clarity. There are moments when the world appears like a vast theater, beautiful, tragic, mesmerizing, yet somehow transparent. You watch people chase illusions with complete sincerity. You observe how the mind constructs identities with the same seriousness a child builds a sandcastle. You witness how individuals cling to beliefs, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. And as you see the invisible mechanisms behind this play, it becomes impossible to join the performance with the same innocence as before. You may sit among others, laugh with them, share meals, exchange stories, yet inside there is a quiet space untouched by their noise, a space that watches, a space that listens, a space that cannot be deceived by appearances. And while this clarity is a gift, it carries a price. For to perceive what others do not is to live at a subtle distance from the world they inhabit. To know the movements of the mind is to lose the comfort of ignorance. To see the mechanical nature of thought is to be unable to pretend that the mechanical is alive. To sense the inner fractures of another is to face the responsibility of compassion. And compassion, when it is real, is not sentimental. It is demanding. It sees without judgment, yet it cannot unsee. This is the quiet cost of deeper perception. There comes a moment when you begin to wonder, is this clarity a blessing or a burden? Why can others walk so lightly in their illusions, while you feel the weight of each unspoken truth? Why do they celebrate what you know is transient? Why do they fear what you know is harmless? Why do they worship their thoughts as if they were sacred, when you see that thoughts are merely echoes of the past, repeating themselves? At times, it may feel like standing on the edge of a forest, while everyone else walks confidently through a painted backdrop. They do not know the forest is real. They do not know the depth behind the image, but you do. And once you see the real texture of life, the painted world no longer satisfies. Yet it is not arrogance that creates the distance. It is sensitivity. It is the subtle intelligence that awakens when one stops seeking approval and begins to simply observe. This sensitivity makes you aware of contradictions hidden in everyday interactions. You sense when words diverge from intention. You feel when someone speaks from fear, even if their tone is cheerful. You notice the flicker of insecurity behind a boast. You recognize the longing behind anger. You detect the exhaustion behind indifference. You read the invisible letters written in the silence between sentences, and this sensitivity, though profound, often has no place in the usual rhythm of conversation. Most people do not want to be seen so clearly. Most prefer the comfort of familiar masks. Most are unsettled by those who perceive without being deceived. So you learn to remain quiet. You learn to let others speak while you listen beneath their words. You learn to move gently without disturbing the fragile structures that others call themselves. You learn to dwell in your own clarity, even when the world around you demands conformity. This quietness deepens the loneliness, yet it also sharpens perception. It becomes a kind of inner wilderness, untouched, unclaimed, unrecognized by the noise of society. And still, beneath the solitude, a question lingers. Why does deeper perception create distance? Why does seeing life as it is separate you from those who see life as they wish it to be? Perhaps because most people are not seeking truth, they are seeking comfort. They do not want to look into the mirror unless the reflection flatters them. They do not want to meet themselves, they want to escape themselves, and the one who perceives the invisible cannot participate in these escapes, not out of superiority, but out of honesty. This honesty brings a certain nakedness, a vulnerability, a rawness that does not fit well within a world trained to hide behind explanations and identities. And so, the one who reads the invisible walks with a kind of quiet gravity, neither above others nor below them, but simply outside the illusions that govern most human behavior. Have you ever felt this distance? Have you ever sensed that the things that trouble others no longer hold power over you, yet you cannot explain why? Have you noticed how lonely it becomes when you see what others refuse to see? Share what you observe within yourself. For this loneliness is not an error. It is the early whisper of awakening. It is the first sign that you are no longer confined to the narrow boundaries of thought. It is the beginning of a new kind of seeing, a seeing that costs you your illusions, but gives you a deeper intimacy with life itself. And as this perception sharpens, another realization emerges slowly, quietly. Perhaps the loneliness of those who read the invisible does not come from being separate from others, but from being separate from who they once were. A subtle death, a quiet rebirth, a dissolution of the familiar self. And from this dissolution, a new question arises, a question that cannot be ignored, a question that marks the transition into the next part of this inner journey. If perception creates distance, must understanding create connection? And so begins the movement from illusion to inquiry, from loneliness to examination, from silent seeing to deeper questioning. There comes a moment when the solitude of deeper perception turns inward, not as melancholy, but as a kind of threshold. You begin to realize that loneliness itself is not the true experience. It is only the shadow cast by the fading identity that once sought belonging in what was familiar. The more you see, the less you cling. The less you cling, the more the old inner structures crumble. and each fragment that falls away leaves behind an empty space that feels both terrifying and sacred. This space is misunderstood by many. They mistake it for emotional distance or cold detachment, unaware that it is simply the natural clearing that appears when illusions dissolve. But within this clearing, new sensitivities awaken. You begin to perceive people not as personalities, but as movements of energy shaped by memory, longing, fear, and hope. You begin to feel the echo of their struggles, even when their words hide them. You sense how desperately most individuals cling to their stories because they fear the stillness that comes when the story disappears. And here lies the quiet burden of those who read the invisible. You see the suffering behind the mask, but you also see that they are not ready to remove it. You sense the potential for transformation, but you know that transformation cannot be forced. You feel the truth beneath their confusion, but you understand that truth cannot be handed to someone like a gift. This creates a subtle weight within you, a hum of responsibility without obligation, a compassion that does not interfere but witnesses, a clarity that holds space without imposing itself, and this depth of perception naturally separates you from those who seek distraction rather than understanding. You may find yourself withdrawing from conversations that revolve around complaints, dramas, and repetitive narratives, not out of disdain, but because you can see the loop of thought spinning in real time, drawing the person deeper into their own psychological labyrinth. You can sense that they are not speaking to you, they are speaking to the echo of their own unresolved mind. And you cannot participate in that dance without betraying your own clarity. Thus, the loneliness deepens, not because you are alone, but because the world has not yet learned to speak in the language of silence, awareness, and inner freedom. You begin to crave depth the way others crave comfort. You seek quiet the way others seek stimulation. You value truth the way others value approval. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. When you walk through a crowded place, you no longer see merely bodies moving. You see minds entangled in thought. You see fears disguised as ambition. You see comparisons shaping desires. You see memories driving actions. You see wounds camouflaged as confidence. And though you remain outwardly still, inwardly you are witnessing the entire drama of humanity unfolding moment by moment. It becomes clear that what people fear most is not loneliness, it is meeting themselves without distraction. And yet you have been pushed by life, by perception, by your own inner calling, into precisely that encounter. You have been delivered into the very space others avoid. You have been brought to the threshold where masks dissolve and only presence remains. This is the price of perceiving what others do not see. You are forced to face the vastness within you without the comfort of comparison. You are compelled to stand in front of the mirror without flinching. You meet the shadows of your own mind with an honesty that others might call severe. And in this meeting, a deeper solitude blossoms, not as sorrow, but as clarity. Clarity often feels like loneliness until it becomes understanding. But before understanding arrives, the path grows narrow. The familiar world loses its authority. The old self loses its voice. The noise that once filled your life begins to sound foreign, almost meaningless. Conversations that once felt natural now appear hollow. Activities that once entertained you now feel superficial. People you once admired now seem lost. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they have not yet looked inward. You begin to wonder if something is wrong with you. But the truth is far simpler. You have started to see, and seeing is always solitary in the beginning, because most eyes remain closed. Have you felt this shift within yourself? Have you noticed how your perception changed silently, without your permission, as if life itself decided to open a door inside you? Observe that feeling. Acknowledge it. Share what arises. This journey is not a rejection of the world, it is an evolution of perception. Yet in its early stages, evolution always feels like separation. A seed buried underground knows nothing of the forest it will one day join. A bird breaking from its shell feels the enclosure more acutely than the sky awaiting it. Likewise, you feel the boundaries of the old self most intensely in the very moment they begin to dissolve. And this dissolution reveals something crucial. The loneliness of deeper perception is not caused by the world failing to understand you. It is caused by the old self losing its place. This inner shift prepares the ground for the next movement, the questioning, the moment when the eye that sees also begins to inquire, the moment when loneliness becomes curiosity, the moment when perception meets examination. And that is where we now move. To question is to stand at the threshold between two worlds, the world of habit and the world of awareness. When one sees the invisible, the next impulse is not to escape, but to understand. A quiet inquiry arises, not born of intellect, but of direct perception. Why does seeing create distance? Why does clarity unsettle the structures of the mind? Why do we fear losing illusions that bring only temporary comfort? These questions do not seek answers from books or authorities. They are not solved through theories or philosophies. They emerge from the living experience of observing oneself and the world without distortion. The one who perceives deeply is compelled to ask, what exactly am I seeing? What is this invisible fabric that shapes human behavior so insistently? Why do people cling to identities that cause suffering? Why do they defend beliefs that imprison them? When you look closely, without judgment, you begin to notice that much of human life operates like a script written long before anyone learned to read. People repeat emotions, reactions, and patterns that were handed to them by past generations, cultural norms, and personal histories. They act as though they are free, but their movements are governed by invisible strings pulled by memory. And when you see these strings, another question arises. If human beings are moved by their conditioning, what does it mean to be truly free? This question does not arrive gently. It strikes with a subtle force, because once it appears, nothing in your life can continue unquestioned. If every reaction is shaped by memory, every desire influenced by past experience, every fear informed by old wounds, then where is the you who chooses? Where is the freedom that people proudly claim as their birthright? You begin to observe yourself with a new kind of attention. You see a thought arise, not because you called it, but because something triggered it. You feel an emotion surge, not because it is fresh, but because it belongs to an old imprint. You watch your body tense, not because the present moment is dangerous, but because an ancient reflex was awakened. And this observation leads to a sobering realization. Human beings live inside reactions they did not choose. When you perceive this clearly, the world you once knew becomes transparent, not meaningless, simply unmasked. You see that beneath nearly every action lies a hidden agenda shaped by fear, desire, or insecurity, even generosity, even kindness, even ambition. And you ask yourself, is there anything the mind does that is free from motive? This question opens a deep crack in the foundation of the familiar self. Because if motive governs thought, then sincerity itself must be questioned. If emotion is conditioned, then authenticity must be re-examined. If perception is distorted by the past, then what does it mean to see clearly? These are not intellectual puzzles, they are living inquiries. And the more you observe, the more the inquiry intensifies. Why do people fear being alone if the mind is their constant companion? Why do they fear silence if silence is the natural state before thought begins? Why do they fear uncertainty if uncertainty is the birthplace of all transformation? Perhaps because silence threatens the illusion of control. Perhaps because stillness reveals the chaos of thought. Perhaps because uncertainty dissolves the boundaries that define the old identity. You begin to see that what people call certainty is merely a psychological defense. A shield made of beliefs, a protection made of explanations, a refuge built from the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. And as this becomes clear, a new question arises. Why does the mind insist on protecting illusions more fiercely than truths? Look at the movements of thought carefully and you will see why. Illusion offers comfort, truth offers change, and change is frightening to a mind that survives by repetition. Most people do not resist truth because it is difficult to understand. They resist it because it threatens the identity built upon illusion. This is why the one who perceives deeply feels a kind of distance, not because others reject them, but because others are unconsciously defending themselves from seeing. Have you noticed this in your own interactions? Have you observed how people become restless when a conversation begins to touch the core of their being? Reflect on this. It reveals much about the human condition. Feel free to share what arises. As your questioning deepens, you begin to recognize the architecture of your own psychological structure. You see how memory shapes thought, how thought shapes emotion, how emotion shapes action, and how action reinforces the very memory that began the cycle. It is a closed loop, self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, self-limiting. This is the invisible machinery behind human behavior. And when you see it, a new question erupts. If the mind is a closed loop, is there a dimension of perception that lies outside it? This question marks a turning point. It signals that you are no longer analyzing the mechanics of the mind. You are searching for what precedes the mind. To inquire in this way is to step beyond the boundaries of thought. It is to refuse the easy answers provided by belief, ideology, religion, or philosophy. It is to look directly into the nature of yourself without a filter. Such inquiry requires courage because it dismantles the very structures that make you feel you. And the dismantling is not comfortable. It strips away everything that is borrowed, inherited, imposed, or imitated. It removes the supports that once held your identity together. And in the space left behind, another question glows like an ember. If I am not my thoughts, not my emotions, not my memories, then what am I? Not who, because who implies identity, but what, because what points to the essence beneath identity. This questioning does not yield an immediate answer. It deepens, it widens, it stretches your perception until the familiar boundaries of the self begin to loosen. You start to observe the thinker, then you observe the observer of the thinker, then you observe the silence in which both arise. And this leads to a profound shift. You stop trying to solve the human condition and you begin to perceive it. This is the essence of real inquiry, not seeking answers, but dissolving questions by seeing clearly. The more you observe, the more you realize that loneliness was never the result of seeing too much. It was the result of identifying with the one who sees. When the observer is questioned, when the self behind perception begins to dissolve, loneliness begins to transform into something entirely unexpected: clarity. And clarity is the doorway to a different kind of presence, one that does not belong to the mind, one that is not conditioned by the past, one that does not seek fulfillment through illusion. This transition prepares the movement into the final part of the journey, where questioning gives way to insight, and the solitary path of perception becomes the open expanse of understanding. And now we move toward that expanse. But before insight can reveal itself, the questioning must reach its deepest point. It must touch the very roots of perception. It must turn not outward toward the world, nor inward toward identity, but into the empty space where both the world and the self arise. This is where inquiry becomes dangerous to the mind. For up to this point, questioning has examined thoughts, emotions, conditioning, and human behavior. But when inquiry turns toward the observer, the mind begins to tremble, because the observer is the foundation upon which the mind stands. If the observer dissolves, the entire structure collapses, and so a new, unsettling question arises. Who is the one who sees? Who is the one who asks? Who is the one who feels this distance, this sensitivity, this subtle loneliness? Do not answer too quickly. Any answer formed in thought is already false. Any answer shaped from memory is merely conditioned repetition. Any answer that feels comfortable is almost certainly the voice of the old self trying to survive. When you look directly into the sense of I, without defending it, without explaining it, without naming it, you begin to see something extraordinary. The I is not a solid entity. It is a movement, a flowing process, a narrative constructed moment by moment through thought. There is no permanent self. There is only the continuity of memory pretending to be a self. To see this is to feel the ground shift beneath you. It is to discover that the one who feels lonely is not an enduring entity, but a temporary formation, a psychological habit, a story told over and over until it feels real. And so the questioning deepens. If the self is a story, who is the listener of the story? If the observer is a movement, what is the stillness in which the movement occurs? If thoughts pass like clouds, what is the sky they pass through? These are not metaphors. They are direct inquiries into the nature of consciousness. As you observe more carefully, the distance you once felt from others begins to transform. You realize that what you perceived in them, their fears, their wounds, their illusions, are not theirs in a personal sense. They are universal patterns of the human mind. You saw them in others only because they once existed, or still exist, in you. This insight gives rise to a new understanding. The loneliness you felt was never separation. It was the beginning of compassion. Because when you see the inner workings of your own mind clearly, you can no longer judge the confusion of others. You can no longer condemn the blindness that once governed your own life. You understand that people act from conditioning, not from freedom. They act from fear, not from malice. They defend illusions, not because they love them, but because they fear the emptiness behind them. And in this understanding, a subtle tenderness appears, a natural kindness, not the sentimental kindness of moral instruction, but the effortless compassion that arises when judgment ends. Have you ever noticed this change within yourself? How clarity begins to soften you rather than harden you? How seeing deeply makes you less reactive, less defensive, less entangled? Share what you observe. It is part of this unfolding. As the inquiry expands, you begin to ask, if the self is not real in the way I once believed, why does it feel so convincing? Look at the structure closely. The self is made of memory. Memory creates thought. Thought creates emotion. Emotion reinforces the sense of identity. Identity strengthens the belief in a separate self, and the cycle repeats. This cycle is the invisible machinery that governs human beings. It is the machinery you have begun to see, and seeing this machinery is what created the distance you once called loneliness. But now the distance begins to feel different. It is no longer separation. It is space. It is clarity. It is openness. The questioning continues. If the self is maintained by thought, what exists in the absence of thought? Not the forced absence of meditation techniques, not the suppressed silence of discipline, but the natural stillness that appears when thought exhausts itself. Observe deeply. There is a space before thought, a space during thought, a space after thought. This space is awareness, not someone's awareness, awareness itself. It is the silent background upon which all thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise. It is the vast field in which the self appears and disappears like a temporary ripple. And when you begin to sense this background, another question arises. If awareness is constant and the self is changing, which one is truly you? Do not rush. Let the question burn. The more you inquire, the more the familiar identity begins to feel like an echo rather than a reality. You begin to sense a deeper presence behind all experiences, a presence that does not belong to your story, your personality, your preferences, or your past. A presence untouched by fear, untouched by desire, untouched by the illusions that shape the human mind. And as this presence reveals itself, loneliness begins to evaporate, not because others changed, but because you discovered the dimension of yourself that was never separate. This is the threshold, the silent turning point, the moment when questioning naturally dissolves into clarity. And with that, we move into the final part of this journey. Clarity does not arrive as an answer. It arrives as the dissolution of the one who needed answers. It arrives not through effort, but through the exhaustion of struggle, not through accumulation, but through the quiet falling away of all that is false. Clarity is not something you achieve. It is something that remains when confusion ends. To see this is to understand why those who perceive the invisible often feel alone in the beginning, because clarity empties the space where the old self once lived. But as the inner space opens, loneliness transforms into a presence so vast, so quiet, so intimate that the word lonely loses all meaning. For in clarity, the center that once felt separate dissolves. There is perception, but no perceiver. There is awareness, but no owner of awareness. There is life unfolding, but no separate self struggling to manage it. The solitude that once felt heavy becomes spacious. What was distance becomes depth. What was separation becomes silence. And silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of inner friction, the absence of the compulsive movement of thought, the absence of the psychological noise that once clouded perception. In this silence, you begin to realize that everything you perceived in others, their wounds, their fears, their illusions, was not other at all. It was the shared human condition reflected in countless forms. There was never a division between you and them. The division existed only in the mind. When the mind becomes quiet, the boundary dissolves. You begin to see that all beings move within the same field of consciousness. All experience arises from the same source. All suffering emerges from the same ignorance. All clarity blossoms from the same stillness. And in that recognition, the loneliness of deeper perception transforms into compassion without effort, without intention, without obligation. Compassion becomes as natural as breathing, because you no longer see others, you see yourself in all forms. This is the quiet transformation the world rarely notices. A person who once felt separated by clarity becomes united by that same clarity. Have you observed this shift within you? Have you felt how seeing deeply softens rather than hardens? Share if something in you recognizes this unfolding. As presence deepens, the illusions of the world appear like ripples on the surface of a vast lake. They move, they flutter, they disturb the shallow layers, but the depth remains untouched. And from this depth, you observe life without attachment, without resistance, without the need to impose your story upon it. This is freedom, not the freedom to do what you want, but the freedom from the inner compulsion that once dictated what you thought you wanted. Freedom from fear, freedom from the past, freedom from the tyranny of thought, freedom from the illusion of separation. And with this freedom comes a new way of being in the world. You act, but you are not defined by action. You feel, but you are not imprisoned by feeling. You think, but you are not bound by thought. You relate, but you do not lose yourself in relationship. You see the world, but you no longer distort it through the lens of the self. Life becomes simple, not in a superficial sense, but in its essence. You respond to what is. You stop negotiating with what was. You no longer chase what might be. The price you once paid for perceiving what others do not see turns out to be an investment, not a loss. For in giving up the comfort of illusion, you receive something far greater, the unmediated intimacy of reality. You begin to sense presence not as a mystical idea, but as the natural state hidden behind the noise of the mind. A quiet awareness accompanies you, not as something you control, but as something that simply is. It does not come and go. It does not fluctuate with mood. It does not depend on external circumstances. It is the stillness beneath all movement, the silence beneath all sound, the open sky behind all passing clouds. This stillness becomes your home, and from this home you engage with the world with freshness, clarity, and a sense of profound ease. You no longer perceive people through the lens of expectation or judgment. You see them as expressions of the same consciousness, each at their own stage of unfolding. Their confusion does not frustrate you. Their illusions do not disturb you. Their fears do not weigh on you. You understand deeply and wordlessly that they are doing the best they can within the limits of their current perception, and so you walk through the world lightly, without leaving psychological footprints. You speak when necessary, but your words arise from clarity, not compulsion. You act when appropriate, but your actions emerge from presence, not from the desire to appear a certain way. You listen fully because you no longer listen through the filter of the self. There is an openness in you now, a quiet transparency, a natural humility that does not lower you, but frees you. This freedom is not dramatic, it is not ecstatic, it is calm, like the calmness of a vast night sky. It is spacious, like the open horizon. It is intimate, like the gentle rhythm of your own breath. In this state, the question of loneliness becomes irrelevant, not because you have found companionship outside, but because you have dissolved the inner separation that once created loneliness inside. The one who reads the invisible no longer feels apart from humanity. You simply see more clearly, and in that clarity, you recognize that all beings share the same essence. The difference was never in perception. The difference was only in awareness. And now that awareness has revealed itself, the journey that began in solitude ends in unity. Have you seen this possibility within yourself? Does something in you resonate with this unfolding clarity? Allow the question to settle. Share what moves in you. For clarity is not a destination, it is the natural state awaiting recognition once illusion dissolves. And when illusion falls away completely, something extraordinary becomes evident. The loneliness of those who read the invisible was never loneliness. It was the early light of awakening. And now that awakening has begun, the path is no longer narrow. It opens into the vastness of life itself, a life lived not through the mind, but through presence. Nothing more is required, nothing more is missing, nothing more needs to be understood. There is only this moment, only this awareness, only this silent depth, and in this depth you are home.